Hello, everybody that's tuning in on this Saturday morning. My name is Jose Martinez, and I do education at the Mexic-Arte Museum. I'm currently here at the museum right now. I'm upstairs, nobody's here, so I'm not wearing my mask because no one else is in the office. But we're joining you from the Mexic-Arte Museum and our panelists from their homes or studios. And today we present the Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead Symposium. Its history and celebration from ancient to contemporary times. And we have our curator and director of programs, Dr. George Vargas from the Mexic-Arte Museum. And he's going to be introducing each one of the panelists and their respective fields and expertise. And they'll be basically speaking on their sections and expertise on Day of the Dead. And so with that, I'm gonna pass it to Dr. George Vargas, and I'll just be moderating, and then I'll be facilitating the Q&A at the end as well. So thank you again for joining us on a Saturday morning, and let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Jose. Bienvenidos. Welcome, one and all. My name is Dr. George Vargas, curator and director of programs at Mexic-Arte Museum in Austin, Texas. Today, Mexic-Arte Museum presents the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos Symposium, its history and celebration from ancient to contemporary times. This symposium is presented in conjunction with Mexic-Arte Museum's 37th annual Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead exhibition. As part of the museum's mission to present, promote, and preserve Mexican, Mexican American, Latinx, Latin American art and culture, we organize this symposium to better understand and to better appreciate Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, its history and celebration. We are indeed fortunate today to have 6 learned scholars who will share their knowledge with us concerning Day of the Dead. The symposium includes 3 sessions. Session number 1, Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, and the Pre-Columbian World. We feature Dr. Carrie Rote, Professor of Art History, Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. She will be speaking on Feasts and Femurs, celebrating the Days of the Dead in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Next, Professor Elliot Lopez Finn, PhD candidate at the University of Texas, will be speaking on ancestral veneration in ancient Mexico. The second session is called Evolution and Development of Day of the Dead. Includes Mary J. Andrade, a well-known independent scholar. She will be talking on the altars of life. And Dr. Carrie Cordova, Associate Professor of American Studies, University of Texas. She will be talking on Dia de los Muertos and the politics of mourning in the United States. The last session, session 3, is entitled Contemporary Expression on Day of the Dead. It includes Dr. Rachel Gonzalez Martin, Associate Professor of Mexican American and Latina Studies at UT, University of Texas. They will be talking on En la Calavera, Embodying Death, Embodied Memories. And last, Dr. Charlene Villaseñor, Black Professor of Ibero-American Art and Chicana Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, will speak on Ofrendas to Memory, Judith Hernandez's Juarez series. And we have a special guest in our viewing audience, Judith Hernandez, a very important historical figure of the Chicano art movement and the 5th member of Los Four. So we'll begin with the first session. Dr. Carrie Rote, please begin. Thank you.
Oh. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Greetings and welcome to my discussion of feast and femurs celebrating the Days of the Dead in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. I will be discussing the manifestations of the dead and their ever-presence within the community of the living through symbolic means and also through curation of ancestral bones from familial tombs. I selected Oaxaca as the center of my discussion as this was an area of focus in my studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I also have had the opportunity to attend modern celebration of the Days of the Dead in Oaxaca on 3 separate occasions. In my presentation, I will be focusing on the traditions. Sorry, I'm having trouble forwarding here. I will be focusing on the traditions of the Zapotecs of Oaxaca during pre-Columbian times, with particular focus on Monte Albán, the Mitla Fortress, Lambecheco, and the Rio Verde site of Yuqüe. We will mainly be focusing on the Central Valley of Oaxaca with a brief foray to the Pacific coast over here. The formative and classic periods of the Zapotec extend from about 700 BCE to about 700 CE. The Zapotec culture, like other Neolithic civilizations in Mesoamerica and around the world for that matter, was based on agricultural subsistence. This form of subsistence generated a high degree of social stratification, inherently evident in elite burials associated with familial house complexes. As a result, political power was characterized by unequal access. It was incumbent upon the ruling families to justify their authority through rituals and ancestral femurs displayed to the public. Additionally, agricultural dependence created a demand for water to sustain the crops. So oftentimes the symbols of water and corn appear in elite burials. The increasing demand for water, exacerbated by population growth, eventually contributed to the collapse of the classical Zapotec stronghold of Monte Albán, causing multiple centers like Lambecheco to rise to prominence in the waning days of the Zapotec hegemony. Prior to this dispersion of power, Zapotecs relied on the invocation of apical lineal ancestors linked to high status by birth or marriage in order to maintain a complex social and cultural system which was interactive. As a result, the ancestors of the elite were venerated in the east rooms of their homes. Near or underneath these east room shrines, family mausolea contained the burials of deceased family members, including the reinterment of remains in mummy bundles. As the living members of lineages walked through their homes, they were literally walking upon the underworld where their forefathers resided. In addition, part of the pan-Mesoamerican belief system is inherent in the Zapotec practice of the evocation of the ancestors for intervention in worldly affairs. By locating the remains of the apical ancestors directly underneath their homes, they could curate select bones from these tombs, utilizing them for the legitimization of power. In the formative and classic phases, the political sphere of the Zapotecs expanded out from their capital city of Monte Albán in an effort to provide crops for an expanding population. In such a climate, celebrations tied to the ancestors among the Zapotecs were not limited to honoring the dead during the autumnal festivals of the Little and Great Feast of the Dead, but were also tied at that time and at others to fertility and rain rituals. Ritual specialists known as rainmakers would culminate their ceremonies with a ritual facing the east room of the house, the one dedicated to the ancestors. Ancestral spirits were also invoked in rituals of political legitimization, divination, and the interpretation of dreams. Due to the multiple roles that ancestors played in community and familial life, the iconography associated with these burials is complex and multifaceted. Corn, the Zapotec rain god Cosijo, and animal doubles appeared in mummy bundles or reinterred remains, in partial remains of ancient disturbed primary burials, and undisturbed primary burials. At this time, consanguinity is complemented by some references to spousal relationships when the female lineage could boost the social position of the family. Art historical manifestations of these ideologies have become more broadly available with recent excavations, which have bolstered older conjectures that were made at Monte Albán and Lambayeque. The main plaza of Monte Albán, which you see here from the north platform, the area of the north platform was covered down the slopes by hundreds of tombs, many of which no longer contain remains or artifacts. Notable tombs here include Tomb 104, Tomb 105, which was not on the north platform, and then Tomb 7. In the context of this presentation, Tomb 7 contained a vast number of sumptuary arts from a subsequent Mixtec interment during the 14th century CE. Along with gold artifacts, there was discovered this human skull embedded with turquoise mosaic. A skull like this one is particularly evocative of contemporary Day of the Dead iconography. The curation and decoration of defleshed skulls is just one of the rituals undertaken in pre-Columbian times. More directly related to the discussion at hand are the femurs displayed above Tomb 6 at Lambayeque. Lambayeque is a small site that rose to prominence near Tlacolula in the eastern arm of the Oaxaca Valley at the time of the collapsing of Monte Albán as the center of power around 700 CE. Because of this, the elites kind of dispersed to other smaller sites like Lambayeque, and the local elites here established themselves upon the models of their predecessors at Monte Albán. They adapted the same complex housing structures with familial tombs along with the iteration of genealogical constructs. Lambayeque's ruling class was elite enough to create tombs which incorporated stucco masks, which are a rarity in this region and were made possible through interregional trade. Of particular interest to us is the tomb that you see on the right, Tomb 6. According to analysis by Lind and Urcid, this tomb belonged to the Yuqüe, or ruler of Lambayeque. As such, it rests beneath the home of the ruler and contains three representations of three royal couples. One pair or one couple is located on the lintel directly above the tomb, while the two other couples appear on a mausoleum erected above the tomb. This one is kind of hard to get a picture of. So this is a picture that Barbara Riley took when we were on our trips to Oaxaca. But according to Urcid's reconstruction, the mausoleum originally contained another level, which also included two more sets of ancestor portraits. In these upper marital pairs, the heads of the female are presented and the male figures are presented as if they are swimming. In between the male and female figures, there appear day signs with numbers, which provide us with the names of the individuals represented here. Looking closely at the males in each panel, you will see that they are holding femora in their hands. Femora were powerful symbols in ancient Mesoamerica. As the longest bone in the body, their size and durability make them a potent visible symbol of our human existence after our death. They can be displayed by descendants as a legitimacy of their descent, saying, I have my grandfather's femur, therefore I am the legitimate ruler and have the right to rule. Also, in the pre-Columbian world, it was believed that the femur or thigh bone contained an individual's power, and that could be power for good or power for evil. Either one would be possible. Tomb 6, when it was excavated, had several remains in it. Within those remains, 9 of the 12 femora of the deceased were missing. It is believed that these bones were removed for power displays. It was only the last extended burial in the tomb, which was found complete, indicating that there was a pattern of disruption of the tomb for the removal of the femurs. Further evidence of this practice has been discovered. Oh, and I just brought this in as there's the femur, the size of it, with a human skull. So you can see it is a powerful bone, the largest bone in the human body. Further evidence of this practice has been discovered at the Meatlift Fortress in a more recent excavation. At this site, there was discovered an intact burial exhibiting deliberate femoral curation. This classic period burial site had been reopened in antiquity. The femur had been removed, and then the tomb was carefully resealed. The femur was the only bone missing from the body, which I think you can see here in this particular image. Deer femurs were sometimes utilized to create external duct flutes. The oldest such flute in Mesoamerica is the Yuqüe flute that we see here. This flute was made from the left femur of a white-tailed deer and dates from the late formative period of 100 to 250 CE. It is the first such flute to be found within its original archaeological context. Interestingly, the flute was not found in a home mausoleum, but instead it was found in a cemetery burial. The young man who was buried with it was clutching this flute in his left hand. Flutes, as musical instruments, make sound. By making sound, they become animate objects. This particular flute is further animated by the human figure carved upon it. This figure has here a skeletal head and torso, but flesh-covered limbs which come down towards the end of the flute. The breath of life is represented by the figural portrayals on this flute, which has been deeply analyzed by Barber and Olvera Sanchez in 2012. So I'm just providing you with a summary here, which represents death and fertility, becoming a part of rain, wind, and agricultural deity complexes. Additionally, the position of this figure on the flute makes it appear that the sound emanates out of him directly, and also his eye socket is utilized as one of the holes that makes music. Ancestors were also commemorated by the Zapotecs in funerary urns of a unique and a style that is specific to this region. The urns were found empty. We don't really know in the funerary context. They may have carried water or some other foodstuffs in real life and then been interred with the deceased. Examples of these urns reflect the individualization of iconography in different settings and circumstances. The urns often tie the individual represented with deities, but also contain numbers and day signs indicating that they were intended to represent the deceased with whom they were buried. Urcid in 2018 provides us with these examples of the day signs that appear on a variety of urns. There are hundreds of these. The references to deities present apical ancestors of the different families. To flash forward, I had previously mentioned that I had observed the Days of the Dead in Oaxaca in 2001, 2003, and 2009. I am bringing it up here for several reasons. First, the festival is brought in with a cold wind. The spirits of the deceased children arrive the first day with a cold wind, the deceased adults on the second day with a cold wind. If you've been to Oaxaca at this time of the year, you know that wind that I'm talking about. This cold wind in pre-Columbian times is considered to be like the breath of the flute, the voices of the dead floating in the air. Secondly, it made me think deeply about traditions, how they are developed and how they change and remain the same, depending on who is involved with the festivities. During my 3 visits to Oaxaca, I noticed changes in the celebration. On our first 2 visits, we were led a group of scholars by Juan Cruz of Jojocotlan. Cruz accompanied us because he was a tapete artist, and he is someone who's very interested in retaining the tradition of tapete making. Here is an image of another artist who was creating one in the church at Jojocotlan. Other tapetes were created in the streets, and others were also created in the cemeteries. I am here represented assisting Juan Cruz with the tapete on top of his father's grave in 2001. Subsequently, we invited Cruz. Oh, and there we are. There is his mother laying out the candles after we have completed our part of the project. We also invited Cruz to Corpus Christi, where he made a tapete in the Center for the Arts at our university. He brought his own tools and pigments, which you can see here. He also brought his tapete stencils with him, which, as you can see here, are very fragile. These stencils, it's a male pastime to make tapetes. And these stencils had been handed down to Cruz by his uncle. We worked alongside Cruz for an entire day, completing what he called his ofrenda, or offering to us. After 3 days, we were instructed to dispose of the tapete, since it is not meant to be a permanent item. We actually, 2 of us, picked it up and disposed of the tapete in a trash can. Juan Cruz is very interested in keeping the traditions and the knowledge of the past alive. In 2001, he took a group of school children to Monte Albán, where he discussed their history, the great works of their ancestors, and invoked in them a sense of pride of where they came from. Cruz has also worked to strengthen tapete making by bringing young men into work alongside him. I guess my overall point here is that the evocation of the ancestors, both recent and ancient, weighs heavily on the minds of the Zapotec people. And if we look closely, every day is a Day of the Dead in Oaxaca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carrie Rowe. Next, Professor Elliot Lopez Finn will speak on ancestral veneration in ancient Mexico. Professor, please.
All right. Assuming, stop me if you can't hear me very well or if the sound isn't working. Hello, everyone. I'm Elliot Lopez Finn with the Art History Department at the University of Texas at Austin. I'll just open my talk with a quick land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving my talk from Texas in the ancestral lands of the Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Kickapoo, and Comanche groups, as well as the many others I have listed. In addition, my discussion today celebrates the native traditions of the Nahua of central Mexico, the Maya of Mexico and Guatemala, as well as this larger diverse tapestry of cultures and peoples found throughout Mesoamerica, past and present. So today I'm just going to be giving us a quick glimpse into some of these underpinning ideas that bridge ancient practices with the celebrations of the Day of the Dead today. I'll be building a bit on Dr. Rote's earlier discussions. Largely, I'll be focusing on some of these ideas of ancestral veneration, how the concepts of life and death are characterized, and kind of this idea of a larger cycle of life and death. To orient us, I'm going to be mostly focusing on central Mexico in this area, but I will be talking a little bit about Chiapas and Guatemala as well. So I'll mostly be focusing a bit on Aztec culture and the classic Maya. So as you guys have already probably noticed, there's a great diversity of burial types and rituals for the dead across time and cultures in Mesoamerica. So we've seen some of these discussions of home mausoleums and cemetery tombs from the Zapotec, whereas in my region and time period of focus among the Mexica, or the Aztec, as I'll be calling them, cremation and burial in funerary urns was also common. So I have some examples over here to the right. In turn, many of you can probably easily envision the funerary temple pyramids of the Maya. So I have an example over here. So that's a monumental version of some of these burial practices where your ancestors would be interred in burials closer to home, often with offerings. Underpinning all of this diversity, though, are some shared concepts. And it's many of these concepts that resonate into the celebrations that take place throughout Latin America today, and in the US, of course. For instance, death may appear as an animate personality among the Mexica and other groups. Oh, my screen is not shared. Oh, I am sharing a PowerPoint. This is odd. So my screen isn't shared, but I thought you guys had done that for me. Let me figure out how to do that. I apologize. Green button at the bottom. Oh, there we go. I apologize. I was showing all of these awesome pictures. Here we go. Okay, so I'll just start from the beginning, or I'll give a quick background of what we were talking about then. So, okay, just to give us again that geographic orientation. So I'll be in central Mexico here, down along the border of Chiapas and Guatemala as well. So again, kind of thinking back to that diversity of burial practices. I had mentioned those funerary urns that hold the cremated remains. So that's a pretty common tactic among the Aztec, and also some examples of those more monumental tombs that we find among the classic Maya as well. So here's kind of what I was mentioning about that idea of the animate personalities that are representing death in ancient Mesoamerica. So among the Aztec, we have two main figures, Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecutli, who are these kind of deities that are overseeing the lands of the dead. And some of that idea of these animate personalities kind of resonates into today's ideas as well. Some of these embodiments of death might take on a more humorous tone, or they might still emphasize the role of death as this powerful figure. And we even see some of these ideas in imagery from cultures before the Aztec as well. So these supernatural beings of the land of the dead might be a little spooky, but they're powerful and necessary parts of this larger cycle of life and death. In fact, among the Aztec, this idea extends to the earth god themselves, who is not shown as a cute little maize goddess like Chicomecoatl on our left. So Chicomecoatl is this maiden who's an embodiment of corn. There's actually part of a larger pantheon of these young maidens who represent different types of sustenance or fruits of the earth. Instead, Tlatelolco is often shown, so they're pictured on the right here. Tlatelolco is often shown with wild hair, a skeletal jaw, and sharp claws, consuming sacrifices. So Chicomecoatl and other deities of these different types of food are actually coming from this more powerful, less immediately benevolent being. So I mentioned that idea of reciprocity kind of at the beginning of the talk, and this is really what I'm talking about. It's this recognition that new life, whether we're talking about food or people, requires the consumption of life. So kind of part of this larger cycle. And some of this persists into today's imagery as well. So we're all familiar with the Cempasúchil, the Mexican marigold, which appears in ancient works, actually more closely associated with rain and agricultural gods, alongside corn cobs and chili peppers. Whereas today it's kind of more explicitly linked to this autumnal period around the Day of the Dead. So even now we're seeing this kind of intentional meshing together of imagery of life and death, recognizing that both are two sides of the same coin. So ancestors and other deceased peoples figured into this equation in both literal and conceptual ways. Among the classic Maya in Mexico and Guatemala, we'll find imagery of the deceased, which emphasizes their potential for rebirth in this continued cycle. So I've pictured up here on the right a pretty well-known illustration for the stone sarcophagus of Pacal, one of the kings of Palenque. Or, yes, sorry, I accidentally wrote Yaxchilane, it's Palenque, in Palenque. So in this image, he has actually fallen into the jaws of the underworld. So I'm pointing that out with my mouse right here. So he's kind of fallen into the jaws of the underworld, but from his body emanates this jeweled tree topped by a bird. In addition, the sides of the sarcophagus have imagery of ancestors emerging from the ground, and also behind them are kind of sprouting these fruiting trees as well. So in this funerary context, this area in which his body would have been kept, the link between death and this continued cycle of life is being emphasized. And it was actually the responsibility of the living to venerate and continue to interact with the dead, especially with the giving of offerings. So in Pakal's tomb at Palenque that I mentioned earlier, there's actually a set of stairs that led down to the chamber with his sarcophagus. So archaeologists, it took them actually a couple of seasons to excavate all the way down to his tomb. And once they arrived at his tomb, they found that there's the stone sarcophagus with enough space to move around it. So whether or not this was open for a long period of time or for a short period of time after his death, there is kind of the space that's been set aside where his body was meant to be viewed and visited. Other imagery that we actually have from the classic Maya as well are recording instances of people. In this case, I'm mostly talking about rulers because we're looking at stone monuments, but most likely this is happening kind of across the board. But the imagery that we have often is of rulers that are visiting ancestors and leaving offerings. So on the right here, I have this example from Piedras Negras, where ruler 4 is offering incense to one of his ancestors who's been visually separated in this monument's composition to kind of make clear that the ancestor is, while receiving offerings, in kind of this conceptual other space. He's not necessarily in the land of the living. So these stone monuments, they do give us a window into the religious life of these people and into kind of their beliefs about cosmology, about how the world works, that line between the living and the dead. And what we see is that ancestors are an important point of contact with the sacred, with the divine. You could ask your ancestors for help or for protection or for blessings. So in this panel from Yaxchilan, Lady Cabal Shok, who is a queen of Yaxchilan, is pictured. So I have the whole monument here on the left, but I've kind of pulled out some imagery that I'll talk about in a minute on the right. So in this image, Lady Cabal Shok is burning paper that is soaked with her blood to summon an ancestor who is embodying the spirit of war. So this twisting serpent creature that I've isolated to the side here is actually kind of an animate embodiment of the smoke that's emitting from these burned offerings. And it's from the snake's mouth that the ancestor who's dressed as the spirit of war is emerging. So when we're looking at imagery like this and like the stela from Piedras Negras, these monuments are revealing how many people in classic Maya culture viewed the world, where this divine between the mortal world and the supernatural was thin and permeable and able to be blurred through bodily sacrifice, through ritual. In fact, the importance of ancestors still having power after death, I mentioned it's kind of one of these larger underpinning concepts across Mesoamerica. And we see that taking the forefront in histories that are recorded by the Aztec. In Aztec narratives that are kind of recording these migration histories across central Mexico, Huitzilopochtli is alternately a founding ancestor of the Mexica line, or he's a deity who could be consulted with for protection or for guidance. So when leaving the ancestral home of Aztlan, the Mexica brought Huitzilopochtli. I believe he first led them, and then after death, they carried him in a funerary bundle during their journey. So we'll actually see in painted histories, when Huitzilopochtli is shown as a deity, he's often decked out with his very fancy hummingbird headdress and his quetzal feathers. Or if he's acting kind of more in this guiding ancestral role, we might see him in a funerary bundle where he still has that little hummingbird headdress on, but he's being actually carried by somebody across the landscape. So it's through consulting with him in the form of this bundle that the Mexica were able to kind of make their way across the landscape and found Tenochtitlan. So he's one of these beings that's kind of blurring the lines between an actual ancestor and a patron god of the Mexica. And what we actually see when we look at the various historical narratives that a lot of these different groups have preserved over the years in central Mexico, many of these lineages have their own specific patron deities that guided them over the landscape. So we're all very familiar with that Aztec story of migration, but actually a lot of groups in central Mexico have similar tales as well. And these different patron deities, these different ancestors are shown in imagery through their iconography, through the symbols that are used to refer to them. So you guys are already familiar with Huitzilopochtli's hummingbird headdress that I showed. So here's another imagery on this, another image on the right of somebody bringing their bundle with Huitzilopochtli. For other groups, for instance, some Tezcatlipoca is actually their founding ancestor. And he's kind of invoked by the smoking mirror carried in this bundle instead. So iconography becomes kind of a shorthand to refer to these founding ancestors and to these specific gods. So when I talk about this visual shorthand, this iconography, it's actually part of a larger system of thought where the deceased can be invoked through their belongings. So among the Aztec, gods and ancestors were said to have ashkaik, which is Nahuatl for property. So their property after death might be gathered into a bundle that could be carried or stored or pulled out during specific festivals and occasions. And it was these bundles that are being interacted with for guidance and what are receiving offerings during celebrations. So in some of these images here, I just have some examples of these intricate bundles that are basically pulling together the personal effects of ancestors. So again, it's that whole idea of you're interacting with the materials of the dead in order to connect with them. And this might actually remind some of you who have a bit of kind of exposure to Christian art history, this idea of saint reliquaries, where again, it's the actual belongings and bodies of the dead that are kind of retaining a sacred inner quality. So I just wanted to put this up there to kind of remind us that we're seeing this expressed in other cultures as well. The difference between what we're seeing in Christian art and European art and the areas of our focus is the ability for people to embody ancestors and deities through the handling and wearing of their belongings. So among the Aztec, putting on a god or ancestor's regalia actually allows somebody to assume their identity, and they might replicate sacrifices that that founding ancestor or deity made. They might preside over ceremonies and provide blessings. And we actually will find the archaeological remains of the regalia that people wore to embody these specific ancestors and deities. So I'm just including this one image from Reuters, where it was a recent excavation at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, where they actually found some of the regalia related to those who would dress as Huitzilopochtli, that founding ancestor, and act as him. So as we've kind of touched on in the earlier talk by Dr. Roth, it's that direct handling of both the objects of and the remains of one's ancestors that provides this way of maintaining a close connection with them to keep their memory alive. So I actually do have an example of one of those, I believe this is a femur, of an inscribed bone from a classic Maya tomb. But I also have some examples above as well of basically jawbones that have been modified, inscribed with imagery, and have been modified so that they can actually be worn as pendants. So through its treatment, we can actually see that the human body itself is the sacred material, and that the actual wearing of and handling of these objects is a way of connecting with the sacred. We can shift our focus to that inscribed bone below. This was actually found in the tomb of a king from Tikal, Hasauchan Kawil I. And it's actually not his bone. He was found with 37 inscribed bones from different individuals that were interred alongside him. And some of them were actually labeled talking about different ancestors, but some were also about captives, some were marking other important occasions. So ancestral veneration is an important part of this, but not the only reason. And in this image, actually, though, I chose this one because I thought it was a nice way of tying together some of these different themes, where we have this heirloomed bone in the tomb of this king of Tikal. And the central image is actually from a larger narrative of the maize god's death and rebirth. So the maize god is actually in the center of this image, and he's surrounded by these supernatural beings that are accompanying him into the underworld. So the outer two beings, we'll often call them the paddler gods. They're these two beings who are the ones who are guiding the canoe to the underworld. And then we have these other creatures who are accompanying the maize god, and they have their hands pressed to their foreheads in mourning. So the decorated bones that we've discussed so far are pretty obvious examples of objects preserving the memory of the deceased. But we also have many examples of ceramic vessels and objects for bodily adornment, such as ear spools, that were given as heirlooms and passed down. So in one tomb, we might find the jewelry or ceramic vessels of somebody's father or mother that had been passed down to them, and then they were buried with them. And it's usually with the classic Maya, through the writing, that we're able to kind of trace those lineages and trace that heirlooming pattern. There's evidence that this is occurring among the Mixtec as well. So looking at painted histories, we'll often see some passing down of important items of regalia as well through family lines. So that's actually coming from Byron Hammond's work as well. So what we're seeing here is that it's the property and the bodies of the deceased that become important ways to connect with them and preserve their memory. Those are often the objects that one would use to kind of venerate, for those venerations and for those leaving of offerings. Okay, so what I hope has emerged from this very brief peek into ancestral veneration are themes of continued contact after death, where the living are responsible for caring for and connecting with the people of the past. The ancestors after death don't necessarily disappear. They continue to have power, and they continue to be able to protect, to bless, to kind of exert influence from the realm of the dead. So the dead themselves are powerful, but not necessarily to be feared. Rather, they're part of this larger cycle that we're all kind of involved in. Okay, so that's about it. And I would just like to once again thank the Mexic-Arte Museum for inviting me to speak today. So yes.
Wonderful presentations. Thank you, professors. We'd like to invite questions and comments at the end of the presentations. And of course, we'd like to as well invite any kind of comments or questions from our special guest, Judith Hernandez. We'll continue now with session 2, Evolution and Development of Day of the Dead. We begin with Mary J. Andrade, a very well-known, famous independent scholar. She'll be talking about altars of life. Mary, please.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be part of this virtual Day of the Dead Symposium organized by the Mexic-Arte Museum of Austin. I want to thank Dr. George Vargas for the invitation, as well as the Executive Director, Ms. Silvia Orozco. I'm trying to share my screen.
Take your time.
Let's see. Sure. Are you able to see the photographs?
Yes.
Oh, thanks. Well, as a photojournalist, I will share through some images of ofrendas my experiences of a journey that I started in 1987, taking me down to many paths, learning how the celebration of the tradition takes place in cities and small communities. It has given me the opportunity to value the ritual, observing similarities and subtle differences in the way family plays their ofrendas. The celebration is known in Yucatan as Hanal Pichán, which means the pass of the soul through the essence of food. In Michoacán, is known as Himbancua, or the celebration that honors with flowers the memory of the person being honored. In San Luis Potosí, Hidalgo, Veracruz, and in the southern part of Oaxaca, it is known as Chantolo, which may refer to the Latin word sanctorum, that literally means holy of holies or festival of all saints. And in the majority of the Mexican territory is known as Day of the Dead. It is a tradition with deep pre-Hispanic roots. Of all the activities regarding Day of the Dead, the offering represents the profound expression of the blending of the Hispanic and indigenous cultures, which was declared in 2003 by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Tianguis is the first stop to purchase food, craft, cempasúchil flower that will be displayed on the offerings and on the tombs. On this photograph, we see the figure of Xicontencatl, a pre-Hispanic prince and war leader of the state of Tlaxcala. The offerings are placed on the ground covered by cempasúchil flower. We see tamales, considered the food of life, tortillas, fruit, and atole, a drink made with corn. Tall candles surround everything present on the ofrenda. On this offering in Tlaxcala, we observed the fusion of the pre-Hispanic and the Hispanic cultures. Displayed are the Christian images as the cross and several saints' images on the ground, representing here, representing the mortality is a cross made of soil. On the center, a cross made of salt, representing the sacrament of baptism, and the cross of cempasúchil flower representing earth. In the southern part of to Puebla, there is a small town known as Huaquechula. The offerings there represent to a certain extent the Baroque aspect of Mexican artistic character. They measure several feet tall and are decorated only with white cloth, divided in different columns and sections in which candles, flowers, and small angel statues are placed. This design originated during the colonial period on memorials that were erected in Catholic churches during the Holy Thursday, inspiring the residents of Huaquechula to decorate their ofrendas and monuments in similar fashion. In Yazacatlan de Bravo, a Mixteca town in the southern part of Puebla, the offerings are placed on the ground, and usually they take a whole room. They are protected by a wall of yellow candles measuring up to 3 feet tall. On the night of November 1st, in many homes, as part of the ritual, baskets are prepared with the best of the offerings and placed outside next to the candles for the souls to pick them up as they pass by. The Chantolo celebration is considered a sacred time in the Huasteca region. In Los Pinos, a small community in the state of San Luis Potosí, dishes with food are placed on the ground, covered with a small embroidered napkins. They place also cups with coffee, because it is the belief of the inhabitants of this community that the souls prefer to drink coffee. The celebration of Chantolo is also a celebration of the harvest of the corn shared with the souls through the special dishes prepared for them and placed as part of their ofrendas. In the town of the Huasteca Potosina, it is customary to create one arch inside the home to welcome the deceased and another outside for the lonely soul. Adults make the wooden structure of the arches, which are placed by the front of the table. A white tablecloth covers the table, and the religious images are placed on it. The oldest person of the family is in charge of building the arch, conscious of the fact that one day they will not be here, and that way they prepare themselves so they can meet death when it comes, when strength, certainty, and dignity. Visitors are welcomed with a tamale and a drink. Then he or she gets closer to the altar, drops a little piece of the tamal on the floor, and it does the same thing, dropping a few drops of the drink to the ground. It is a way to honor Mother Earth. In the Huasteca Hidalguense, arches are built in different ways. Depending on the community, the arch can be built within a square or a rectangle shape with very elaborated decorations, as a variety of flowers, oranges, limes, pieces of sugar cane, bananas, tangerines, and small baskets are hung from the arches. Children participate, performing a small task, fashioning rosaries of cempasúchil, which requires the threading of flowers on a string about 7 to 10 feet long. Ocotepec is part of the city of Cuernavaca, capital of the state of Morelos. Visiting homes, I observe a unique way how the new offerings are built. Family members place pieces of banana and a lot of bread. Then they cover it with a white tablecloth and they place a sugar skull on the top. If it's a woman, the soul that they are expecting to receive her visit, it will be wrapped with a rebozo or shawl. If it's a man, it's used, a sombrero is used as an addition to the regular attire. The cloth is purchased for this occasion, so the deceased wears a new outfit. On this ofrenda, the clothing of a woman and her shoes are visible. Once the body is formed, the flowers and candles are arranged around the ofrenda. Mixquic, a naval town, is located near Mexico City. On November 2nd, small floating altars move slowly on his channels. His inhabitants open the doors of their homes to let visitors to come in and see their altars. It's a very peculiar and unique way to show the bread on these rounded colored designs, which are as part of the ofrenda, but also they are used as part of the decoration. Large amounts of ofrendas or offerings are placed on the ground and also on the 5 levels of this altar. In the different towns of the central valley of Oaxaca, the arch welcomes the soul with the food and drink prepared especially for the honor of the soul. On this one, we see another small arch dedicated to a child. The ingredients of mole negro of the region is one of the ones that is used on several dishes from which the soul will enjoy the aroma, taking in the substance of the food. In the southern part of the state of Oaxaca, in Tehuantepec, we find the Identifiers. This is a Zapotec style ofrenda that it takes also the whole room. It is bent on top to form an arch, and the banana plants are usually decorated with cempasúchil flowers and pan de muerto. This ofrenda is a combination of the pyramid style of the altar and the biquié. On the biquié, they usually place the offerings on the ground around the image or photograph of the person who's being honored. On the biquié, this is a sample of a biquié. You don't see the religious images. There is one cross decorated with flower, and that's it. But if you walk behind this biquié, you will find the Catholic altar with the virgins and saints full of flowers. But this shows like a separation between the Christian belief or the Catholic belief with the traditional aspects of the Zapotec culture. Here we see rectangular pieces of bread with the name of the person who is honored, and is hanged on this wall covered with vegetation from the area. As part of the ritual, a blessing takes place done by a neighborhood leader called Shuana, who approaches the offering with burning copal while he prays. The use of banana leaves is very common as a tablecloth on the Yucatan Peninsula ofrendas. The small pieces of mukbil chicken or chicken pibil are also wrapped in banana leaves as part of the offerings. The small rooms are built to protect the ofrendas. Candles of different colors are lit, and plants from the area are used as decoration. A similar style of altar we find them on the Mayan communities of the state of Quintana Roo. Their ofrendas are divided on 3 levels. The bottom level usually is dedicated to the lonely soul, and on the top 2, they place their offerings. There are ofrendas that have only 1 level, and usually the cross is dressed with a small huipil if the altar is dedicated to a child. In Naulinco, Veracruz, the celebration of fieles difuntos is known as La Noche de la Cantada. A group of young people dressed as Catrinas and Catrines go to the cemetery and they sing prayers by some tombs. Then they move into the town and start visiting the homes where there is an ofrenda nueva. On this photograph specifically, this group of students are performing this ritual of singing prayers by an ofrenda built on a cultural center. One of the unique aspects in Naulinco is the decoration of the room where the offerings are placed. Usually the ofrendas are covered with papel picado, and the ceiling is also covered with these beautiful designs, and you find this style of decoration on the ofrendas all over town. Jimbanco in the state of Michoacan honors their dead with a variety of flowers, including orchids. In Santa Fe de la Laguna, the arch is placed on the back of the ofrenda, and everything that the neighborhood and the family members bring into the home to honor the soul is placed on the ground over a petate. The elder people of town perform a ritual similar to other towns where they pray for the rest, for the descanso of the soul. And later, the owner of the house come and place pozole or atole with bread by their feet as a gift of all the family to them. Caballitos enrosados, or little horses, are part of the offerings that family members neighbors bring to this ofrenda to honor the soul. These carajitos will be taken to the cemetery the next day and placed around the tomb. There are only 2 places in the state of Michoacán where these type of offerings are done. Guanajo in the Lake Pascuaro area, and in San Angel Surumucapio in the Purépecha Plateau. The pre-Hispanic origin of the tradition of Day of the Dead is alive. His profound structures are hardly modified. Families believe that the memory of a loved one must be kept alive through the rituals of the celebration. Ofrendas honor the legacy left by a person, not only to his family, but to his community. And personal items, photographs, special dishes, flowers, and candles are placed in their memory year after year as a profound expression of love and life. Thank you again for inviting me to be part of this symposium.
Thank you, Mary. Next, we have Dr. Carrie Cordova presenting Dia de los Muertos and the Politics of Mourning in the United States.
Hi, can you see me? Okay, great. Hello, I'm just gonna share my screen if I can. So, and let me start the show. So, all right. And so, greetings, and first of all, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, George, especially for incorporating me into this special event. Dia de los Muertos has, both meant a lot to me as a scholar and just, growing up. I'm presenting here an image of an altar from my father's basement when I was growing up. And it was a communal altar that was created by him and his friends. And so it's made an impression on me from a very young age. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how it's changed over my lifetime as well. And so part of what I'd like to do today is talking about its evolution, its transformation, its sort of history within the United States. And a lot of my work has been focused on San Francisco, so I'm going to draw on that archive from San Francisco, but I think that in doing so, it connects with a lot of the sort of celebrations in Austin and around the United States. And so hopefully others will see that as well. And just one of the first things that I would want to acknowledge is I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, but this is obviously a very spiritual celebration based on all of these traditions that my colleagues here have highlighted so beautifully. I'm interested in some of the ways in which the tradition has changed since the 1970s and into the 1990s. And in relation to social change in the United States. And so part of that means that I would like to spotlight the way in which it connected, or the Chicano movement connected with this event and made the celebration far more public and visible in the United States. And we see the way in which altars or ofrendas move from inside people's homes and into galleries, museums, parks, and other public places. So now we have this world in which Coco has given like enormous public visibility, a global visibility to this event. But I think it's important to reflect on the ways in which prior to the 1970s, the event was far more private and much more undocumented in its celebrations until Chicano started to connect some of the ways in which they wanted to reflect on their indigenous heritage, create educational programming, and provide means of connections and means of mobilizing civil rights concerns. And so it nicely also intersected with some of the interest that was emerging in multicultural programming at the time. And so the creation of ofrendas, processions to the cemetery, and public performances gave the event a great deal more visibility publicly. This is not to say that the event was unknown in the United States. It absolutely was, and many people in San Francisco and in Texas had been celebrating this in their homes for a long time. One of the earliest sort of more public discussions that I've had with some of the artists that I've worked with was Yolanda Garfias-Wu talking about teaching Muertos to her students in the 1960s at John McLaren School, because she was seeing so many children that were experiencing grief from the loss of loved ones as a result of terrible sort of high crime in the neighborhood, and murders and violence, domestic violence too. And so this was a way for her as a teacher to try to reach out to her young students. And so there's also some reflecting on that, I think. Yolanda Garfias-Wu is an artist that I've looked at a lot because she was instrumental, at least in the Bay Area, and circulating her ideas of traditional altars. She was inspired by her family's Oaxacan celebrations, and she became a great teacher to many other folks in the Bay Area as well, and a bit of a scholar and a writer. And so this is one of her sort of mid-1970s altars that you can see here. Some of the earliest public celebrations that I have found in the Bay Area, moving Muertos into galleries, were in 1971 at a place called Casa Hispana, and in 1972 at Galeria de la Raza, which probably became the greatest spearhead for celebrating publicly Dia de los Muertos in the Bay Area, and held subsequently annual events to commemorate this event and to draw in a lot of people, both through gallery shows, through artist calls, and through the procession that they created. And a lot of the materials were often paying tribute to indigenous materials or to traditional craft. And so you can see some of the things that were put on the walls at Galeria de la Raza, just to sort of mark the mascaras, the masks, and all of the, you can see, like, here's some work by Ralph Maradiaga, his silkscreen poster that was sort of marking a particular kind of aesthetic that was very traditional. And that's also something that I just want to mark about the 1970s work, that there were sort of that it was much more traditional in its aesthetic scope, and that changed over time. And what was also discovered is when the De Young Museum invited Yolanda Garfias-Wu and others to join in a Mexican Day of the Dead celebration at the museum, they discovered that it was actually profoundly successful in bringing in new folks into the museum, Latinx folks in particular, into the museum in a way that they hadn't seen before. And this helped solidify, like, institutional support for the event that hadn't been present before. And so what you see are also some of the ways in which the altars were forming in the late 1970s and drawing on the calaveras. I see a lot of reverberations with some of the slides that Mary Andrade was presenting to us, and sort of thinking about, like, all the traditional sort of materials that artists in San Francisco and celebrants in San Francisco were looking at and drawing on and trying to keep this tradition very much alive, and including papel picado. And so one of the events that I think dramatically changed the event, at least in the Bay Area, was when in 1978, Galeria de la Raza hosted a show for Frida Kahlo, a Dia de los Muertos event entirely dedicated to Frida Kahlo. And here you can see some of the materials that were presented in the show. And in dedicating Dia de los Muertos, in 1978, at a time when Frida Kahlo was actually just regaining recognition. A book by Hayden Herrera was just coming out at that time. And the exhibit was curated by Carmen Lomas Garza, Amalia Mesa Baines, and Maria Pinedo. They created a powerful statement, turning the event into a sort of marker of a way of not just remembering the dead, but remembering someone that was important to the larger community. And in dedicating this, the traditional private offerings to friends and loved ones was transformed to a profound homage to a public figure. So in the late 1970s, the Galleria also started a public procession for the event, and they were likely also inspired by the success of Self-Help Graphics procession in Los Angeles. So I think that either started earlier or around the same time. The first procession counted about 100 people, but by the 1980s, thousands were participating in San Francisco's Dia de los Muertos procession, which of course also created a number of stresses on the event, as it was struggling or in tension with whether this was a commemoration, celebration, or a party, especially in its close proximity to Halloween and a number of other celebrants sort of joining in. But with this sort of over the course of the 1970s, you can see that people in the Bay Area are developing strong programming for celebrating Dia de los Muertos. They're developing like a longer understanding and history of the traditions. And they do so in a way in which then I think the event also is able to evolve over the course of the 1980s and into now, such that I think that the celebration is also, and always has to some extent, become an important place for protesting the biopolitics of death. So thinking about the way in which the event facilitates public mourning that can also talk back to social and cultural inequalities. And so thinking about, for instance, what it means right now to have multiple altars dedicated to the impact of COVID-19's unequal impact on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, or for instance, the altar that was at Mexic-Arte last year, commemorating the victims of those killed in El Paso by a shooter. And so expressing not just mourning, but also like an opportunity to join as a form of this is not okay. And similarly thinking about the ways in which a number of altars have been created against the surveillance policies on the US-Mexico border that have contributed to widespread death and femicide. And so I'm interested in how we get to some of these more outspoken sort of statements through the ofrendas. And I think it does draw on a long history that also exists in Dia de los Muertos, sort of grappling with the influence of an artist like Jose Guadalupe Posada and his famous engravings, which often poked fun at Mexico's elite, reminding everyone that no matter how wealthy or privileged, no one escaped death. And so thinking about the ways in which the celebration has also always had a kind of punditry, political punditry within it. And I do go into a lot more of this in my book, but I'm going to try to point to two events in particular that I think were really instrumental, at least in San Francisco, in challenging the shape and direction of the event, and in particular, both the impact of AIDS and US intervention in Central America. And so one of the things that is very visible in studying a city like San Francisco is the phenomenal impact of AIDS. And certainly we can feel like what that feels like right now in the midst of a pandemic. But I quote essayist Richard Rodriguez saying, in San Francisco, death has become as routine an explanation for disappearance as Mayflower van lines, right? So AIDS devastated the city. Between 1981 and 1986, San Francisco recorded more than 1,500 AIDS-related deaths, and the numbers only continued to rise. So residents sought both private and public ways of coping with the fear and trauma, including candlelight vigils, public memorials, and cultural production. And here you see some of the murals that were created. In addition, what we also had, and perhaps less obvious, is that the city also served as a center of the sanctuary movement for hundreds of refugees escaping the gruesome civil wars of Central America. So with a Latino population dominated by Central Americans, many in San Francisco were personally impacted by the thousands of desaparecidos in El Salvador and Guatemala, and others simply sought to articulate their sense of shock, fear, and outrage at the violence abroad. So those grieving for Central America and those grieving for AIDS felt frustrated and helpless, particularly in the context of President Ronald Reagan's administration, whose policies only seemed to aggravate both situations. And so I think in sort of setting that forward, we can start to think also about the ways in which people found the need for Dia de los Muertos to take it in directions that were more openly and politically expressive of their concerns about who was dying and why. So, and with that, I also want to acknowledge the ways in which the altars were already starting to change a little bit. And so here you can see some of the altars and materials from, the 1980s. You can see this is a later sort of installation that is talking about Muertos, and so critically pointing to McDonald's as as an indictment of a number of decisions that McDonald's makes in terms of their menu and all of those materials. So I want to sort of give that also as background, and thinking about works like Rene Castro's altar, Burn Baby Burn. And he says, when you reach my age, you don't need to be walking around burning flags. And so it's the caustic calavera, subtly but humorously conveyed the role the living must play in critiquing American politics, since it is too late for the dead, right? And so there are these other sort of materials that are forming, and you can then start to see the ways in which, people are mourning for their countries. My pretty Nicaragua, right, in 1987. Or some of the poster work by Juan Fuentes that is both, it's a poster, but it's definitely drawing on and even being shown in Dia de los Muertos settings, or thinking about processioners and the ways in which, the material culture of the procession is reflecting the political concerns of the attendees. The work of Esther Hernandez in particular does a really good sort of reflecting back and forth, drawing on the material culture of Dia de los Muertos to create the Sun Mad Raisins poster that she's very famous for. It also was part of an installation that unfortunately I don't have a picture for right here. But thinking about the ways in which she as an artist was pulling on this material archive and then also shaping it in a way in which I think a lot of people have lost sight of the way in which this has origins out of Dia de los Muertos, right? And so thinking about this work that she has done, a number of other works, she has a self-portrait with Tecate, watermelon, and nuclear explosion, which also plays on the altar imagery. And another work that is famous of hers is the Weaving of the Disappeared, which is drawing on the traditional tejido cloth, but also incorporating images of helicopters and dead bodies and small skulls, and obviously has blood on it, as a way of both marking the experience of US intervention in Central America, and critiquing it. And so again, this also was part of a larger installation that Hernandez placed in Galeria de la Raza. And this image has then also been recreated and has moved again also away from its origins with Dia de los Muertos. So I think the theme of violence in Central America continued to inspire local artists throughout the 1980s, sometimes with direct statements, and at other times more abstractly. Here it's pretty direct. You can see in a procession, we Salvadorans salute our brothers and sisters and spit in the face of the military that assassinated them. Right. And so you can, when you see something like this, you can see how different it is from some of the imagery of the original processions, right? Where the capacity to speak out is so profound here. And then in addition, of course, is local artists. And I think, it is interesting to look at when does AIDS become visible in the celebration of Dia de los Muertos. One of the earliest altars that I found in San Francisco is from Juan Pablo Gutierrez's altar, a public altar, I should say, at Galeria de la Raza in 1984. In which it says, while society turns its back, we die by thousands and thousands. Boy, sounds familiar. In any case, works such as this show how ofrendas became a powerful medium to mourn, as well as demand activism. At the same time as this was up in the Galeria de la Raza, you also had a performance in relation, and you can see the pink triangle and the muertos and the dead, and this sort of like way in which Muertos was becoming a space to evoke protest, right? And, in 1984, prior also, I want to mark to the AIDS quilt that started in 1985 in San Francisco. And so also just thinking about what's happening in the 1980s, that people are so deeply in need of the capacity to mourn publicly, to share mourning. And so we can think about the fact that we had the AIDS candlelight visual in 1983, the AIDS quilt in 1985, Art Against AIDS in 1987, A Day Without Art in 1989. And we have a culture that is mobilizing to try to create public spaces for mourning. And Dia de los Muertos fits in so perfectly with some of these other concerns. You can also see it commemorated through the work of filmmaker Lourdes Portillo and her work La Ofrenda. And here you see an altar from that film. And so thinking about the ways in which in San Francisco and around the globe, the intersections between Dia de los Muertos and AIDS became more prominent. Grace Cathedral, an Episcopal church, created a Day of the Dead service as part of its AIDS Day of Remembrance. And Yolanda Garfias Wu talks about a Presbyterian church who invited her to set up an altar in Oakland. And she stated, I was kind of surprised because there were almost no Hispanics. But when I went there to do the presentation, they had a huge AIDS quilt out. And they said that so many of their parishioners had died that they really wanted to do an altar in their church. And so I'm pointing to this as a way in which her experience represents how Dia de los Muertos altar making filtered throughout the city and beyond, largely in response to AIDS, and that also in response to concerns about the dead in Central America, the desaparecidos, and that gradually Dia de los Muertos transitioned to respond to a vast range of spiritual and political desires for mourning. And since 1990, Dia de los Muertos has experienced considerable growing pains as a result of its popularity, particularly in terms of the procession, which grew from a few hundred to thousands by the 1990s. So while the altars inside were becoming more experimental, something also that could be addressed more, and more multicultural and installation-like and more dramatic, the procession also was undergoing changes. Most notably, the physical distinctions between Halloween and Dia de los Muertos were blurring. And by the early 1990s, the public celebration of Dia de los Muertos had undergone a dramatic shift from its initial homage to indigenous cultures, right? In many ways, the public presentation of the event has superseded some of the personal, familial, or communal nature of its origins. Perhaps something also we could talk about. The public celebration is widespread and easily incorporates the regional culture of its location. So its very malleability has allowed it to percolate and appear in many places beyond some of its traditional locations, including, as I mentioned, Brattleboro, Vermont, or anywhere, right? And so arguably the decision to invoke Dia de los Muertos to articulate political sentiments was not a unique expression, but part of a long-standing tradition in the Americas. And notably, the contemporary expression of political sentiments has become more forceful and direct. And so this is an event in 2004 looking at Dia de los Muertos on the border and sort of the public condemnation of deaths on the border that this was attempting to point to the larger world. And so thinking about Cuantos Más, right? Thinking about Cuantos Más right now in terms of COVID-19, I'm basically wanting to sort of help us think about how this event has evolved from some of the ways in which it was more private into these public spaces, and what that has done in terms of allowing people to speak back to the politics of death. And so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are very inspirational presentations. Next, let's move to session 3, Contemporary Expression on Day of the Dead, beginning with Dr. Rachel Gonzalez Martin, speaking on En la Calavera, Embodying Death, Embodying Memories. Professor.
1 second, let's see. Hello, thank you so much for having me. First, I'd like to say it's the presentations have been absolutely beautiful, and feeling like I'm coming in at this far end after Dr. Cordova's wonderful presentation. We're going to see a different side of contemporary interpretations of Dia de los Muertos. And I'll begin with the narrative and a few other pieces. But I do want to say that especially the early presentations that are contextualizing the pre-Columbian and the non-US based celebrations, we could really see sort of this arc of sort of what happens when people and culture migrate or are recontextualized in these different socio-political spaces. So I'm just really grateful for the wonderful work that precedes me, because I feel like my work here is very niche in many ways. And so I am talking about En Calavera. So this idea of transforming into a calavera during the Days of the Dead, but very specifically, and how that aesthetic comes to be a cultural representation of US Latinx identity as sort of multiple sort of standard deviations away from what it was, with the Mexica, with the Maya, or even in contemporary Mexico with living indigenous populations. And I just have to say, Mary Andrade, I use your work in my Latino folklore classes, so it's so wonderful to actually see you in person. So I'd like to thank Dr. Vargas and all the folks at Mexic-Arte working hard to keep traditions going in the face of necessary community separation. And by that, I mean COVID. I appreciate the invitation to share my ideas and research on community practices. I'm trained as an anthropological folklorist, meaning I spend my time observing living cultural practices rooted in community memories and investigate not just the enactment of practices, but the context of their production. As you might imagine, investing in US Latinx or Latine communities means examining social and political contexts of oppression as well as resilience, fueled by historical traumas that replay themselves on a loop through continued widespread systemic inequalities. While our common ground as Latinx, Latine, Chicanx, Chicano, Chicana, Chicane, Afro-Latino, Latinx, Boricua, Salvadoreña, Garifuna, Tejano, Mexican, Black, Mexican, Mixtec, Zapotec, Maya, or any one of the myriad other blended strands of our hemispheric roots, my work aims to foreground resilience in the form of creativity, often examining how the body, the marked, racialized, and hypervisible quote unquote brown body, works as a liminal site of unification between traumatic pasts and hopeful futures. Now my work primarily is on US quinceañera celebrations. And so the book that I've produced and my research to this point has really focused on young Latina bodies. But one of the great pieces of wisdom that came, I think literally in one of the first interviews I ever did, was a mother telling me, I just want my daughter to have good memories of her childhood. That's why she was putting on a quinceañera. And it blew my mind in the sense that it came to be this strategic move of understanding that to be a successful adult in the United States meant being able to look back at your childhood or your youth and have happy memories. And so the idea of the celebration of 15 años became a memory-making opportunity. Similarly, I want to think about this idea of Dia de los Muertos celebrations as this moment for this creation of a secular different identity that's being drawn from these, these thousands of years of history, and thinking about the depth of indigenous knowledge, depth of violence, colonial contact, all of these elements. And what we'll see in my presentation is this use of aesthetics as a reminder of trauma, but also as an indicator of a process of healing. So I'm trying to think. So transforming en Calavera can be seen as a way in which we remind ourselves that our antepasados walk with us always, especially at the ritual time out of time between October 31st and November 3rd, but that today we are still alive. And I think that affirmation is one of the elements that comes through as we think about Dia de los Muertos as more than a moment to think of when the dead are around, but as this notion of really understanding the celebration of life. My first trip back to the Bay Area after I started my graduate program in the Midwest was a full year after I had departed. I returned to document and collect objects for a small museum exhibit I was curating on Dia de los Muertos, quote unquote, folk art, in particular art for sale, pop art, and what people would consider tchotchkes. I was eager to document the range of cultural saturation that Dia de los Muertos imagery achieved in my hometown of Oakland, California. So I'm right here with Carrie in the Bay Area, picking it up in the early 90s. I had my own fascination with the celebration, having grown up around the public festivals since childhood. My mother, a public librarian who dutifully helped plan and execute annual events before they became citywide multicultural marvels and were only the purview of the Fruitvale district, or in the case of San Francisco, the Mission district, and its majority Mexican descent community. This year was different. I hadn't been home nor been in a large or familiar Latinx community for some time. And I arrived not as a celebrant, but as a novice documentarian. And in true form, I was running late. I found myself entering the Oakland Museum of California, trying to weave my way through observers who were packed into the stone halls that led to a main courtyard where the day's festivities would take place. Community altars, sugar skull making booths, t-shirt, jewelry, face painting, a carnival of the dead. I was stuck behind a large crowd, and as I tried to wriggle through bodies to position my camera, I stopped. I saw smoke, billowing smoke from a copalera, and the rattle of shell ankle rattles created a wall of sound. There were dozens of danza azteca performers gathering in their grand entrance to lead the opening ceremony of the day. I caught sight of them in the haze of Copal, a parade of calavera danzantes, and I pulled myself against the wall to get out of their way. I couldn't help it. It was so beautiful that I began to cry. Looking back, I still puzzle at my uncontrollable emotional response to the calavera danzantes. There was something special about that moment, their emergence in what was previously a familiar space, a space of the living. The presence of their group, not just with skin painted as bones, with hollows, but the unmistakable smell of copal, of marigolds, and the sounds of ayoyotes entranced me and moved me to remember all the things I missed about being home. Thinking about the United States as the zone of cultural production, we see the cultural practices and ideologies of Latinx descent communities folded into many anachronistic contexts. The co-presence of calendar customs of Halloween or Celtic New Year's, Samhain, and the subsequent Catholic All Saints and All Souls Day makes the interpretation of Dia de los Muertos or Days of the Dead complicated and at times entangled in customs and interpretations that are alien to the communities who remember the ancestral traditions, the ancestral dead on nights and days between November 1st and November 3rd. So one of the things I want to remind folks is that as we think about this idea of being en calavera, my perspective is very much in the United States, 21st century or 20th century, 21st century, with the recognition that as I think of being en calavera in this US cultural space, I'm thinking of a space of nostalgia and memory for participants, but I'm not, and I'm thinking this is an image from the Mexic-Arte's 2015 Katrina Ball, right? So this beautiful, elegant social performance that happens on a variety of different levels, but I'm not necessarily thinking about making it equivalent to indigenous celebrations that are currently still very, very active across Mexico in particular, Southern Mexico, Latin America. And in fact, this image is about a conference that's going on also right now, thinking about the commercialization of the Purépecha indigenous practices, which rely heavily on the UNESCO notification that that Pátzcuaro and Michoacán, and particularly the indigenous area in the Purépecha highlands are seen as UNESCO heritage sites for Day of the Dead. So they're also these extremely powerful places to draw both domestic and international tourists into Mexico. So definitely looking at these images, we're also thinking, and I will be thinking a lot about commercialization, right? And how that becomes part, particularly of our identities as Latinx people living in diaspora in the United States. So thinking about the United States as a zone of cultural production, it becomes really important to consider these ideas of not just what Day of the Dead is in a material form or the actual symbolic meanings of putting together altars or even covering oneself in face paint, but actively thinking about how these present day actions are connected to memories or even the absence of memories. One of the ways in which I think about Dia de los Muertos and the practices that are commensurate with celebrating often are about the way people are understanding what they do as a supplementation to memories they don't have or that they never had. And so I find with my students here at UT, this idea of, well, my family, I must be missing something because my family never made altars, or we never went to the cemetery to remember my grandmother. And so this idea of sort of a supplementary historical narrative that people are creating in the moment with the idea that they're hoping to leave it behind for their children, right? And creating a sense of continuity that, as we know, in circumstances of diaspora that are particularly displacement, violence, oppression, our public history got lost, right? Especially as we think about the way in which becoming a true American, right, often is foregrounded as this loss of our cultural differences, right? This notion that we have to shed sort of an exoskeleton of Latino-ness to truly be connected. And what I'm seeing more and more with communities, I see people adapting traditional practices and saying, we are still who we are, just a little bit different. But so this idea that as celebrations move and change, what's going on in contemporary Mexico looks very, very similar, but also quite different from what's happening in Austin, in Houston, New York City, San Francisco, Oakland, right? And across the country. Donning black and white body paint, chiseling hollow pockets in cheeks and neck, and highlighting the fragile bones that remain in clean white lines. The outline of teeth and jaw without soft flesh, being particularly startling when done with precision, is not a costume. Folklorist Pravina Shukla notes that Halloween costumes in particular represent a shift in individual identities, a revelation of another part of the self. But regalia, or ritual or ceremonial adornment, is meant to serve as an intensification of personal truth, something that is intrinsic of the original self on display, not an alternative self. To dress in calavera is a public declaration of an intimacy with death and a break with the constraints of the rigid Western Judeo-Christian cosmology, even if only temporarily. It is an embodied commemoration, not just of life, but in the socio-contextual context of the United States, it's a remembrance of the celebration of Latinx life and history. And so this very much, although it won't look as political as Dr. Cordova's work, is following a similar line, but with a different sort of aesthetic or practical expression. So transformando en calavera, or transforming oneself into a calavera, is a process of remembering, but also remembering, in sense of bringing a body back to an ideal or a spirit. And it's allowing the bodies of the present to exist out of time as both ancestral spirits and future antepasados, owing to the fact that in a world of famed Mexican artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, la muerte es democrática, ya que a fin de cuentas, güera o morena, rica o pobre, toda la gente acaba siendo calavera. Death is democratic, given that in the end, pale or dark, rich or poor, all people end up being skeletons. It is in each and every day that we ourselves are transforming into calaveras. We will become each day our natural bodies dying a little bit more. However, if we look at poniendo calavera, or dressing as a living skeleton during Dia de los Muertos public celebrations as a form of regalia or ceremonial attire, we can assert that the space of rituals of remembrance, in these spaces, Latinx communities confront of the reality of their unequal share of death head on. Now, to understand the depth of transformando en calavera, we need to examine the shared experiences of a broad swath of Latinx communities and their deep roots across the hemispheric Americas, which has already been wonderfully established by our previous participants. So I'm not going to focus too much on that. But focusing on US celebrants and traditions, we need to understand that the US is unique, right? What we're producing in the United States is fundamentally US American, right? We're not making a direct comparison across to contemporary indigenous communities. And as we saw with Mary Andrade's beautiful photographs, so many of the traditions that we see as very much regionalized and ethnoculturally specified across Mexico get blended in the US. Knowing full well, having celebrated in a lot of public festivals in the San Francisco Bay Area and here in Austin, the different pieces people are drawing on and building something new that in its original context would be kind of strange and inaccurate. But here in the US, it creates a certain kind of community ethos, right? Bringing together different pieces that people can remember and relate to at the same time. So we can see how calavera traditions are part of seasonal celebrations, but also they're borrowed year round. And it's this year round borrowing that I find particularly fascinating, because what it does in many ways is it shows how a Latinx ethos around death, or an understanding of a shared perspective that absolutely comes from the in-depth traditions, you know, migrating north, or that have migrated north and found their way through people and the internet and different sort of ways of the way the hemispheric circuits of knowledge work have become part of a new form of historical memory that we're then manifesting in the present moment. And particularly thinking about how calavera, this image, comes to be secularized. And so the idea of the laughing death, it's not just secularized, but it also becomes quite apolitical, except for the fact that we're bringing it back to a kind of racialized death, right? This notion that that form of a laughing skeleton to be the animated dead, you have sort of these nested understandings of sociocultural history. And it's really fascinating how we'll see it build. And I'll show you images in just a moment. So as we think of the calendar customs, right, we're thinking about the way in which current indigenous populations have a very particular narrative, regional, sacred understanding of what does it mean to don calavera, what does it mean to use this means of communication, and to actively build remembrances or ofrendas in real-time altar spaces. But then we have the idea of what does it mean for spirits to walk among us? What does it mean to actually say, when I put on black and white body paint, I'm creating a different physical reality. I'm ascribing to myself and to my community that I understand life and death differently than someone else, right? So at this time, right, currently, when the dead walk among us, and poniendo calavera becomes an acknowledgement of the opening up of a space between worlds, of the light of the living, of light and warmth and moisture is merged with the world of the dead, darkness, chill, desiccation. So in the United States, these rituals that become removed become irreverent, and their playful tone get sort of intermingled with Halloween iconographies. But Dia de los Muertos images and their presence of this joyful death, this death as a part of life, come to belong to Latinx populations, right? This understanding that this is an ethno-racial identity of itself that comes to intensify a Latino perspective in the United States. So the tradition of tapping into this embodied memorial to cycles of life and death, and indeed our own future deaths, isn't just about a private engagement. In the US, here in Austin and across cities and towns that remember the holiday annually as parts of their efforts to note the growth of local and regional Latinx population, dressing en calavera is, as one artist put it, being a brown skeleton, or declaring an ethno-racial community identity and creating a visible public presence in the process. So one of the key themes that comes with parades and presencing oneself as unapologetically, in this case, Mexican American, but also Latino, is this idea of the visibilization process, that Dia de los Muertos becoming more of a public celebration, as Dr. Cordova notes, is extremely important for understanding where it's going and maybe where we don't anticipate that it's going. So parades, festivals, art walks, pub crawls create spaces for death to index Latinx life. We are here. And that becomes sort of a huge understanding, a huge point when we think about hypervisible Latinx bodies, particularly of young women, of youth, right? This idea of carceral bodies, how are we seen publicly? And then we're thinking about the counter narrative that gets produced by creating this different image of Latinx life that's linked specifically to a kind of bravado around death. So now I'm going to talk through some images so we can get a sense of what I'm speaking about. So thinking about Dia de los Muertos as a public celebration, the images we're looking at here are from last year's, or maybe this year's Dia de los Muertos parade in Mexico City. So we're thinking about, right, this full embodiment of this time of year where calaveras roam the street. And I grew up with these images, and so always saw them as comforting and fun until I started showing them to a body of students who did not grow up with them. And they were actually seeing them as morbid or fearful of the images. And I said, no, this is not that kind of death. and already starting to think about the ethos of a kind of remembrance that is very different from a Western model of entertaining death as something that is outside the home, right, or outside the intimate spaces. What this represents, sort of twofold, the idea that during Dia de los Muertos, much like Celtic customs of Samhain and what's connected to the indigenous origins of Halloween in Europe, is an idea of a time of inversion, right? So the idea of a living body transforming into a dead body fits into that cultural logic or that belief system, but also the idea that streets would now be lined with the dead, right? The dead walk among us. And so the idea of putting on calavera is part of making manifest that belief, right? So this kind of a ceremonial intensification. What also becomes really interesting is the way that these images, and this is Mexico City, so we can already see that there's this variation of the kinds of people, right? We have class relations, we have European history, we have this connection to indigeneity. And we think about what binds these parades in particular or other public celebrations also is this narrative of consumption and tourism. So as we think about the ways in which we saw this idea of consumption being part of, in Eliot's presentation, thinking about consumption of food or thinking about this consumption of what's going on with physical bodies and thinking about representational consumption. So I think about Dia de los Muertos and being in Calavera and being seen, being observed and being noted becomes extremely important. So this image actually comes from a Day the Dead celebration in Oakland, California, from last year or 2 years ago, I believe. And so already you could see very clearly there's a difference, right? In terms of the tone and the form, it becomes slightly separated. You see these sort of half skulls. They're much more ornate. And you can even see the way in which the relating to the celebration is much more festival-like than procession-like. So you have a posada image on this young man's shirt, right? And then we see sort of the way in which iconography has sort of moved across space and time, become popularized, become pop cultural, and then gets fed back onto people's bodies. So it's a different, the starting point and the ending point for being in Calavera, let's say in Mexico City, or those that are folks that are in parts of Mexico that are actively indigenous populations, indigenous communities, this connection to putting on death is a little bit different, right? So in the United States, we're thinking more of this connection to a multicultural presencing, right? When we're thinking about engaging with a face painting booth, right? In a celebration that's meant to draw in community from all sorts of areas, either of a city or a region. So this image is one of my favorites, and it came from my early research on my book. And so what you're looking at is models who are clearly in a Dia de los Muertos procession in Los Angeles in 2015, and they're dressed in calavera. And I found this to be absolutely fascinating because one, quinceañera celebrations are themselves life cycle rituals. They're youth-based, they're about coming into a certain age of maturity as a young woman and taking on cultural and social responsibilities, but they're also about being seen and they're also about being elegant. And in many ways, they're about building this sense of a kind of elevated historical or personal memory narrative. And so I found it extremely fascinating that Hilda Garcia, who runs this company called Modern Quinceañera, was actively having her models, who she styles, have a presence in Dia de los Muertos celebrations across LA because it was part of marketing her dresses and marketing her planning services. And this to me was extremely fascinating because as we think about people maturing and aging into certain identities, it sort of shows this idea of where death sits in our community, that this isn't about a kind of morbidity or about getting old. This is about a different kind of positionality in life and understanding a different kind of elevated relationship between life and death. And so what I found in the last 10 years or so is an uptick in the ways in which quinceañeras and brides are using this idea of being en calavera as a way of intensifying how they think of ethnicizing their celebrations as quinceañeras or brides. And so this is the following year, preparing for that same, I think a procession in Hollywood in California, for these dresses to be featured as part of a fall line of quinceañera fashion, but as calaveras. And what these led to were actually themed quinceañera celebrations of Dia de los Muertos. And so the idea that this is a young woman's portrait about to have her brindis, and she's fully dressed as a quinceañera with a sombrero, but as a calaca, as, you know, a calavera. And her guests at this party were also dressed in calavera. And that was sort of the chosen way to intensify her Mexicanness, which is interesting to think about the ways in which having a quinceañera isn't enough of a Latino identity, isn't as much of a Latino identity, you have to add this extra layer. So I think that was extremely interesting that this is the layer people were choosing to use. It doesn't stop at quinceañeras. This is a Dia de los Muertos themed wedding from 2019 in Southern California. This idea that, again, in a life cycle ritual, celebrating life, celebrating these huge transitions, this image evokes, if people are familiar with the image of Los Novios or a Dia de los Muertos skeleton pair that gets circulated quite often and sold in little figurines, as popular many times as La Catrina. So you get now the embodiment of this image really until death do us part, or in this case, they're starting at this deep image of death, as part of a cultural identity, again, a unique intensification. And then the next level is that these images get circulated. And this is where my work to me is the most interesting, because what we get from quinceañera images, wedding images, is that these then become themes or tropes that are then normalized and become part of other people's celebrations across the country. So this idea of entertaining this notion of the living dead is somehow now a culturally specific way to celebrate all manner of milestones, right? So we're getting way past the idea of private home spaces, activist locations during Day of the Dead celebrations that are public and multicultural, to these other ways of defining life and life transitions based on an understanding of the dead. Here's another, specifically where there's also a Calavera mariachi theme that's also integrated. So this is a reiteration of the quote I was speaking of before, but part of this last piece, so thinking a little bit about those previous images, poniendo calavera, putting on these images of smiling death as both a remembrance of our lives, but also as a kind of reminder of an ethos that's transforming the United States on some level. My work with Latinx folklore has really been embedded lately in thinking about these practices of commemoration. What does it mean to remember together, particularly when we have gaps in our cultural memories together? And thinking a little bit about this idea of the politics of remembering and what does it mean to be told to forget? And so thinking about celebrations like these sort of public narratives, right? Understanding that although they don't necessarily have the same activist tenor as the examples we saw previously, they are establishing a kind of presencing that's meant to serve as a counter story to the way in which our communities are represented publicly but outside of our own control, right? Thinking about media, thinking about political rhetoric, thinking about assumptions of citizenship, all of these elements can see in small ways, in these personal aesthetics, being countered. And with social media and the ways in which we're thinking about global communication, and every Zoom meeting you've ever been on for the last 2 months says that these images can go very, very far. And so this idea of what becomes personal, what becomes public, hazy at best. And that's a good thing, right? As we think about influencing. And so the difference though between Poniendo Calavera, right, on an individual during Dia de los Muertos is that it's an ephemeral production. It gets wiped away, much like the tapetes that were being mentioned previously, they're discarded, right? There's a ritual period and then that ritual period is over. And then we saw with quinceañeras and with weddings, there's a kind of slow durability, you know, opening up that kind of style of remembering or that kind of ethos around death and mourning that is not the same as maybe the US Western counterparts. And then adding sort of photography, right? And creating a slightly more durable image, one that also though doesn't stay. We get this next level where, again, falling in line with the history of lithographic art in Mexico in the early 20th century, right? We're talking about, again, Posada. We're thinking about the ways in which then this aesthetic of death is being sold back to us year round. These pieces are the work of artist Jose Pulido, and I've actually, I believe, bought some of these at the at the gallery store at Mexic-Arte when we were still allowed to be person to person. And I find these to be particularly fascinating because what we have is this idea of an aesthetic of death, but an aesthetic of Dia de los Muertos death, not an aesthetic of morbidity, not the living dead as zombies, right? These are very particularly the honorable, laughing, smiling death, right? That comes to be very much iconic of, in these contexts, right? A US sort of blended Latinx, US based identity. And that's very unique, right? I would not say that this is on par with what's being produced by Purepecha folks in Michoacan to celebrate the dead. This is this commercial offshoot where you get this ethos of Latinx death, right? Or this notion of being sort of haunted by a kind of Latinx commemoration beyond our sort of living community, beyond our even physical presence, with this kind of sort of irreverent iconography, in this case, you know, vinyl stickers. And I look at the images that I have in front of you here, I'm specifically looking at being in Texas, right? We have Calavera Willie Nelson, in case you didn't recognize it, and then a more recognizable sort of image of La Sirena, which we would know from Loteria and other images, except this one's sort of a rockabilly sirena, but they're both in Calavera, right? They're both being marked by a kind of Latino presencing in the United States. And that, I believe, is quite powerful. So one of the things that I want us to think about, or just remember or ponder as we think about seeing this idea of Calavera, this idea of understanding that smiling death, the death that we put on as regalia, as a kind of intensification of our identity, is not the same as a Halloween costume, right? It is a kind of personal politic. This idea of thinking about when we use Latinx bodies, choose to use themselves as a canvas. And the political statement of putting oneself out, the body becomes a site of commemoration, of community commemoration. And so what we can start thinking about is how, by locating trauma, by re-articulating memories of community, how are we thinking about future healing, right? So this idea of a sense of collective memory and embodied performance specifically draws on what we understand as an inter-American circuit of knowledge, right? This isn't something that's manifest from just what's around us, but what we have come to experience, and generational memory and generational trauma. So just to reiterate, so this Latinx commemoration is a function of cultural practices that serve as an affective and political form of collective remembering, particularly for the purpose of resisting narratives of social marginalization and erasure that would ignore past trauma and extinguish the possibility of an autonomous Latinx future. So commemorative practices, which at times look very commercial and irreverent, are still practices that help stave off the fear of symbolic annihilation. We are present through the legibility of deeply or newly embedded traditions that cannot be geared towards preserving a romantic past, but also must be viewed as a renewed investment in this inter-American circuit of knowledge and people. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Next, Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black will present Ofrendas to Memory, Judith Hernandez's Juarez series. Professor, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. I've loved the papers today. Thank you so much, Dr. Vargas, for inviting me and Mexic-Arte into the speakers. And Dr. Vargas was one of my professors back in grad school. So I'm really happy. And I'm happy to meet some of you. I know your work. It's nice to see you on the screen. And thank you also to the artist Judith Hernandez, who is with us today. So today I examine the work of Los Angeles artist Judith Hernandez, important leader and muralist in the Chicano movement in Los Angeles, member of the collective Los Four, and recent focus of exhibitions at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, California, and at the Millard Sheets Gallery in 2017, part of the Getty Pacific Standard Time Initiative. And she's here with us today, and here's a photograph of us talking about her work back in 2017. Hernandez is currently at work on an upcoming solo show, and her artwork has been recently acquired by major museums, including MoMA and the new George Lucas Museum of Narrative Art here in LA. I'm presenting today some preliminary thoughts on one aspect of her career, and it's part of a larger project, and that's her engagement with Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos imagery throughout her career. Her engagement is at once deeply rooted in history and cultural knowledge, but also in the political potential of such imagery. It's a potential that dares to imagine a more just future. So references to Day of the Dead can be identified early in her career when she was still an MFA student at the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles. For example, this ceramic sculpture entitled Calavera y Corazón was part of her 1974 MFA exhibition. In her MFA thesis entitled The Cultural Symbols Which Influenced Chicano Art, Hernandez singled out three particularly powerful symbols: la calavera, skull, el esqueleto, skeleton, y el corazón, or heart. Quote, these symbols are powerfully charged with meaning for the Chicano, end quote, she wrote in her thesis. Notably, two of these, the skull and the skeleton, can be traced to Day of the Dead imagery. In her hand-built ceramic sculpture, which we see on the screen, she joined these symbols together. Now, that same year, in 1973, as the cover artist for the new journal Aslana, Journal of Chicano Studies, she created this, Calavera de Azúcar, for the spring issue, demonstrating her skillful draftsmanship. And then a few years later, in 1976, she brought all three icons together, skull, skeleton, and heart, in her installation, El Destino de la Mujer, an assemblage of wood with broom, lace, fimo, or modeling clay, and found objects. In her thesis, she explains her understanding of these three icons, skull, skeleton, and heart. She valued them for their roots in ancient Mexico, in the worship of deities linked to death. Additionally, and presciently, if we think about her later work, Hernandez pointed out the politicization of such imagery in the hands of Mexican graphic artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, who lived from 1852 until 1913. We've seen him today. Illustrator of the Porfiriato and Mexico's Revolution, known for his satirical broadsheets for Day of the Dead, and I'm showing you some of those. Hernandez returned on later occasions to the specific theme of Dia de los Muertos. For example, in her 2003 installation for Chicago's National Museum of Mexican Art exhibition, Reflections of the Soul, Day of the Dead, and we see her work here, La Reina del Norte, created from wood, plaster, wire net, and nails. Here, Hernandez combined references to the ancient and modern calaveras of Mexico with the heart. She articulated La Reina del Norte with powerful black and white forms, including accents of reds. You can see the heart, the Loteria card, and these ribbons. She added a poignant and pointed feminist message in a poem displayed as part of the installation entitled El Norte. Speaking in the first person, the poem narrates the long life of a supernatural mother figure born, quote, in Cuicatlan just after midnight in the year of the Dark Lord Xoloto, who gave birth to thousands of sons and daughters, many of whom made the trip to El Norte in search of better lives. The poem's final stanza narrates the supernatural mother's death, and I'll read just an excerpt. 1,000 years have passed, and just before midnight on December 31st, 1999, I died in El Norte. I felt the soothing hand of La Muerte close my eyes for the last time, and as my soul passed into the next world, I could only despair. God forgive me. How can a mother teach to hope, but not to dream? In 2015, Hernandez returned to imagery associated with Dia de los Muertos, her Death of the Innocents. And this was one of the standouts of her solo show in 2018-2019 in Long Beach. Created in response to the death of child migrants crossing the border into the United States, as well as the generalized violence provoked by the cartels in Mexico, its powerful message remains pressing today. Death of the Innocents employs visual strategies inspired by the Los Muertos ofrendas. Specifically, Hernandez engages with Mexican Angelito funerary photographs created in the 19th and 20th centuries that we see here. These photographic representations commemorate angelitos, little angels or deceased children, memorialized on November 1st, Dia de los Angelitos, the day before Day of the Dead. In fact, such posthumous portraits are and were frequently placed on ofrendas for Day of the Dead. And I want us to look at these in comparison. You can really see the similarities in this comparison, the child's pose, the white lace embellished costume. In the face of child death, Hernandez strives for dignity, perhaps even sanctity. She presents us with a moving image of apotheosis, perhaps even transcendence, in the face of human suffering. She attains this through the horizontal composition with its figure, the innocent of the title, resting peacefully, eyes closed. One of the figure's angelic wings rises upward. Clutched in the child's right hand, we see a ribbon inscribed, "We come but to dream," added by Hernandez later in 2015, on the day Trump announced his run for president. So it seems perfect that I'm actually speaking about this work today. While the phrase can be understood to reference the dreams of today's migrants and the Daca dreamers, the artist borrowed it from 15th century Aztec poet Tochihuitzin from his poem on the life cycle of humanity. The red and green draperies, of course, allude to the Mexican flag. Notice how they wind around the body, seeming to hold the figure aloft, floating against the dark background. White light emanating from head and wing even suggests apotheosis. Upon closer view, the beholder observes in the background the names of deceased children and the years of their passing: Sofia, Carlos, Juanita, Luis, Esther, Miguel, Raul. The names and dates pull the viewer back to earth to confront the humanity of suffering migrants. 4 observations about Hernandez's engagement with Dia de los Muertos imagery are worth noting at this point. Number 1, I think it's important that Hernandez singles out these visual traditions as significant to Chicana, Chicanos, Chicanexes because of their roots in ancient and modern Mexico. Number 2, she's not only interested in a folkloric engagement, but insists on politicizing the imagery in the context of artists such as Posada. Number 3, specifically, she often wields this imagery in the context of her feminism, recognizing it as inherently feminist, as in her early installation of Destino de la Mujer. And then finally, number 4, she draws upon, is inspired by her family's own traditions, as I will now suggest. I'm showing you a photograph from the artist dating from about 1970-72 of an altar in the home of her paternal grandmother, Maria Castillo Hernandez, in Benson, Arizona. And this other image is a digital collage Hernandez created of her grandmother as an elder. So we see her on the left, her altar on the right, And then with a photo of her as a young mother in the background, and she's holding the artist's father, Pedro, on her lap. Hernandez combined these images in a digital ofrenda, a dreamscape set in the desert around the town of Benson. I linger on this photograph and this digital collage because they suggest and visualize for me how certain Day of the Dead traditions informed Hernandez's Juarez series, such as her association of these traditions with women and her use of dreamscape. So let us now turn to the Juarez series. It's her most extensive series of artworks, begun in 2007 and continuing to this day. Most are created in pastel on paper, moving homages to the often nameless victims of the Juarez murders, or more properly, femicides, feminicidios, the killing of hundreds of women and girls along the Juarez-El Paso border, many of whom were raped or tortured, their mutilated bodies left in the desert. And these murders, of course, as you know, remain unsolved to this day. This triptych, created in 2008, entitled The Weight of Silence, is an early example. In it, we see three women viewed from close up, so from the neck up, their eyes closed. The figures are similar enough to suggest seriality, possibly alluding to serial killings, but different enough so that we see each is distinctive. These aren't portraits, though. Hernandez's female figures are rarely flesh-colored, a strategy to prevent viewers from sexualizing them, and this is in her words. In a recent statement about these works, Hernandez notes that she didn't want her efforts here, quote, to seem in any way exploitive or disrespectful, as she tried, quote, to convey the horror of these murders. That horror is conveyed chillingly by the red handprints, the eerie mark or imprint of their killers, their death. Hernandez created another triptych in this series in 2015, and it's entitled, in Latin, Aetate Sue, trilogy or triptych. This is a Latin title meaning in the year of, pertaining to the year of someone's life. And in each of these portrayals, the viewer fills in the rest of the Latin phrase. So if you look at the Latin phrase at the top, the first one reads, in her 24th year of life, 1997. The next one, in her 19th year of life, 2010. In her 17th year of life, in 2004. Once again, the poses of the three figures we call portraiture. We see from left to right a figure in bust length, a figure in bust length with head and body turned to activate the pose, and a frontal bust length figure. These are not, however, portraits, again, but instead generalized, idealized representations that point to the Juarez victims as they suggest a more universal consideration of women as victims of male violence. The palette is somber, understated, with piercing, poignant touches of reds. We observe hints alluding to their gruesome deaths. And so it's never explicit, right? We see it in these diaphanous scarves and textiles that wind around necks. Hernandez portrays a mask stitched onto one face, a barbed wire crown on another. Between them, the central figure's body is twisted in a pose suggesting a martyr's death. We notice oblique references to their violation, their clothes stripped, leaving shoulders bare. Two of the figures make eye contact with us, implore us, while the central figure's eyes are closed, cast down. Specifically designed to memorialize the deaths of Mexican women along the border, Hernandez's triptych is also simultaneously timeless and universal, an elegy to women throughout the ages. And Hernandez offered me a quote from the Roman poet Statius on the human soul that I think helps illuminate these works. It reads, quote, after death, the soul retains intellect, memory, and will, and around it a shadow or shade is manifested that reflects its desires and affections. We see in these two triptychs Hernandez's uncanny ability to suggest that shadow or shade that lingers in the aftermath of violent crime. Other works in the Juarez series are larger, more epic in scale. Hernandez has written, quote, the epic escalation of the femicides required a stage that was larger, more heroic, end quote. In La Santa Desconocida of 2017, Hernandez presents the victim's lifeless body as a beautiful sacrifice, honoring her in death. Her still purple body reclines in a moonlit desert landscape. Her floral huipil references the indigenous cultures of southern Mexico, the area from which many of the Juarez victims come, leaving family behind to work at the maquiladoras on the border. Despite her peaceful face, Hernandez hints at past violence and the passage of time. The stiffly upraised right hand of the figure is stretched out as if in rigor mortis, or perhaps poised in defense. The shredded bottom of her skirt blows in the wind. Red ribbons, visible in several of Hernandez's works on this theme, wind around her neck and body. On the left, a sinister reference to the source of the violence is apparent, a red hand, an allusion to horrific strangulation. The desert setting for me recalls the dreamy landscape in Hernandez's digital collage that we saw, featuring her grandmother's ofrenda. Within this landscape, the artist speaks of actualizing what she calls these icon archetypes, in this case, a saint, in a dreamscape. Artworks create, quote, a metaphorical stage on which this tragedy would play out in a landscape of dreams, end quote. In one final monumental work, Hernandez puts feminicide into historical context. In Juarez Quinceañera of 2017, a young girl dressed in an elaborate dress for her 15th birthday, but with a Mayan mask for a face, is posed against a pink wall marred by bloody handprints. In an interview with Ramon Garcia, Hernandez linked the Juarez tragedy to the series of calamities in the Americas since the conquest. In this way, Hernandez traces the misogyny motivating these murders back to the colonial era, to the imposition of European attitudes toward women. And to conclude my very preliminary and brief thoughts today, I attempted today to sketch out the history of the artist Judith Hernandez's engagement with Dia de los Muertos imagery in her work from the 1970s to the present day. And I tried to suggest how it might inform her Juarez series on the femicides along the border. I suggested that we interpret her Juarez images as ofrendas, as offerings, intended to welcome back these innocent souls, and also as memorializations, images to commemorate their lives. Because the artist continues to elaborate this series, and indeed has vowed that she won't stop adding to it until the murders stop and the perpetrators are brought to justice, her artworks ask us to not forget. Simultaneously, they ask us to dream, to act, to create a more just world where femicide no longer exists. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Those are wonderful presentations. Are there any questions from the viewing audience at this time? If not, we want to close then. We also want to, Mexic-Arte Museum wants to thank our sponsor, Humanities Texas, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Jose, are you still there with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes, then can we show the music video that we had planned to present?
Yes, I'm pulling it up.
And we offer this on behalf of our friends and family who have died from the COVID and from other causes this year. Thank you again, presenters. You all did a marvelous job.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, show the video.
Thank you, Jose.
One sec. I think I'm gonna, I didn't do the share computer sound. All right, now it should be.
Thank you to Austin Classical Guitar, and we bid you all a farewell. Thank you very much, one and all.
Thank you guys for joining us, and have a great rest of your weekend. Be safe out
Thank you,
there.
Jose.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Adios. Bye, Mary, Charlene, Carrie, and everybody else is still with us.